In this lecture module, we're going to pivot our focus again away from cognitive and emotive meaning and towards those two other mechanisms that help our brain to assign meaning to concepts and to words and to phrases: intentional and extensional meaning. And I'll introduce these using the standard linguistic introduction, talking about them in terms of words in our language, but our concepts have intentional and extensional meaning as well. By a term, I mean any word or phrase that can serve as the subject of a sentence. So terms pick out objects, properties, relations, classes, and so on. Proper names: Bill picks out something, it's a term. Class names: dogs, term. Descriptions: the tallest building in Long Beach, term. Terms serve this function of reaching out and grabbing other stuff, referring to other things, so that our sentences are able to represent the world. Now, we do this with our sentences, but we can do this when we're trying to reconstruct a play in basketball or football, or we're using X's and O's on our whiteboard and so on. So use is just using a bit of the world to stand in for some other bit of the world. And in this case, we're using a term to refer to something else out there: a class, an individual, a relationship, and so on. Sometimes we actually want to talk about the terms themselves. And when we want to do that, then we'll adopt this convention for mentioning them. We put them in quotation marks, indicating, hey, I want to talk not about the significance, the thing that this object refers to in my sentence. Now, sometimes we want to refer to the terms themselves, maybe talk about how they function in our language and so on. And when we do that, we adopt the convention associated with mentioning them. We put them in quotation marks to indicate, now I want to refer to that object in the sentence and not use it to refer to anything else. And when we do that, we're mentioning it. So words are just objects that we use to refer to other objects. And we can also use them to refer to themselves. And the use-mention distinction highlights this point, and it also helps us to understand how we can talk about our own language and how our own language works, even though our language is full of a bunch of terms whose purpose is not to refer to themselves, but the purpose is to refer to other things. What about intentional and extensional meaning then? Well, suppose you walk out in the morning and you look up in the sky and you go, oh, look, it's the morning star. It's the last star visible in the morning. That's a term, the morning star. And you've now used it to refer to something, the thing that you have this criterion for. In the morning, I go out, the last star that I can see with my naked eye, that's the morning star. You go out that evening, sun setting, you watch the sun setting in the sky and you go, oh, look, it's the evening star. It's the first star visible at night. Again, we have that term. That term is being used to refer to something. We have a formula for figuring out what it is we're referring to. And so both of these terms have meaning. And they have meaning in these cases because we have formulas or criterion for how to associate them with things out there in the world. Now, for most of human history, people didn't realize this, but that term, the morning star, that we use that criterion for, the last star visible in the morning, and that term, the evening star, that we use that criteria for, the first star visible at night, both of those things actually referred to the same thing. Usually it's Venus, it's not even a star. That was an empirical discovery. People realized, oh my goodness, we've been using these terms. We have these different criteria and these different times where you're supposed to go out and identify them. And it turns out they don't refer to stars and they don't refer to different things. They refer to the exact same thing. So the morning star and the evening star, they have intentional meaning. They have these formulas that tell us how they relate to the world, how to pick out instances of that term in the world. And they have an extensional meaning, the stuff that they actually reach out and grab. And these two things, well, they often coincide and coincide perfectly. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes they actually don't coincide. Sometimes they pick out the same thing, or they pick out things that we didn't intend to pick out, and so on. So for our purposes, we'll think of the intentional meaning of a word or a term or a phrase as its conventional connotation, its generally accepted meaning, the sort of thing that you would give to somebody if they asked you, well, what does that mean? So someone asks you, what's the morning star? You say, well, look, go out in the morning and look for the last star that's visible in the horizon with your naked eye. And when you do that, that's the morning star. Someone asks you, what's a dog? You say, a dog is a domesticated canine, often kept as a pet. Intentional meaning, conventional connotation. In contrast, extensional meaning is that which that term, with its intentional meaning, actually picks out. Everything that the term dog picks out is its extensional meaning. Everything that the term morning star picks out is its extensional meaning. And intentional meaning and extensional meaning can be at odds with one another. So for instance, suppose you say, hey, what is a unicorn? And I tell you a story about a magical horse with a horn on its head. And you say, oh, that's very interesting. What's a leprechaun? And I tell you a story about a magical character with a pot of gold. These terms have different conventional connotations, different intentional meanings, but they have the same extensional meaning. There just aren't any. It's the empty set. They mean the same thing extensionally. Now you may be thinking to yourself, okay, so intentional meaning, well, that's the connotation. So extensional meaning, that must be the denotation of a term. And that's not true. We use these terms in a slightly different way than you would in your English class. In your English class, the denotation is supposed to be the literal meaning. The connotation is the special implications or associations it has for an individual. By talking about the conventional connotation, what we're trying to pick out here is the literal meaning that people generally associate with that term within our linguistic community. So we're trying to use essentially a combination of these two notions. What people normally associate as the literal meaning within a linguistic community. The extensional meaning is just the reference. It's just all the individual instances of that term that the term picks out. Every single one. Every dog is an extensional meaning of dog. It's part of the extensional meaning of dog. Now you may be thinking to yourself, that's fascinating, Wallace. Really gripping stuff, but I don't really care. Well, it's important, actually. So contemporary logics are extensional logics. And so when we learn formal systems for evaluating deductive logics, we're learning extensional logics. But more importantly, maybe from a practical perspective, confusions regarding intentional and extensional meaning ambiguity arise all the time. So suppose I say to you, look, I think you should really read the novels of Mary Ann Evans. And you say, yeah, I prefer to read male authors. And I say, oh, really? Well, why don't you read the novels of George Eliot? Then you say, okay, I'll do that. No, Mary Ann Evans just is George Eliot. They have different intentional meanings, but they have the same extensional meaning. Just like Sam Clemens and Mark Twain, different intentional meanings, same extensional meanings. And it's not just proper names where this problem arises. Sometimes we'll use definite descriptions to pick out something. So I'll say, look, go to the end of the street, and then when you see the tall building there, go ahead and go inside that building. And I go to the end of the street and I go, oh, these buildings look pretty tall. That's an intentional, extensional meaning ambiguity. I'm not sure what you're talking about. Or I describe somebody as the next president of the United States. And you think, yes, Donald Trump. And I think, yes, Joe Biden. Intentional meaning and extensional meaning ambiguities can arise using definite descriptions. They can also arise by the use of pronouns to refer to things. So if I talk about Bill and Tom, and I say, look, Bill and Tom are really good friends. He's met his new girlfriend and he's really excited about it. Now I've got an intentional and extensional meaning. Who's met whose girlfriend and who's really excited about it? I don't know what you intend to say there because I don't know what the intentional meaning is supposed to be for either of these, and so I can't use them to pick out the extensional meaning. And so intentional meaning and extensional meaning can be at odds. It can use ambiguity, confusion. It can cause mistakes in inference, in argumentation, in communication. This is character Bill the Cat from Bloom County. Bill the cat's only expression is ack. So who knows what's really going on with Bill? When I was a kid, I used to hate the Smurfs. I should have known I was going to grow up to be a philosopher, because the reason I hated the Smurfs so much is that they had all these words with no real intentional meaning. This lecture is Smurfy. It's Smurf to get this much Smurf. Drove me crazy when I was a kid. In the next lecture mod, we're going to turn our attention to the bug fix for these sorts of problems. For vagueness, for ambiguity, for cases where we've got a verbal dispute and we want to resolve it amicably, and so on.